So welcome. I think we can start now. I'll also keep track of the waiting room to let everyone in, but welcome everyone to our lecture series, Young Prototypes, to the third day or the third night, depending on where you are. Today we have our guest, Alfredo Thiermann, and before we start with the introduction, I just wanted to cover some details and introduce these lecture series in case you haven't joined before. So this lecture series explores the notion of design research as an area of architectural production, bringing together the voices of international body of emergent architectural practices. And what we want to do is kind of foreground a generational approach to thinking and building, or building and thinking, which should be inextricably kind of understood together as a modality for operating for architects today. Just covering some of the basic information after our guest's lecture or talk. Today we will have a discussion led by students. So today Nick Malik is moderating, so please feel free to share any questions that you have, those of you who are joining us through Zoom, or also you can put your hand up, of course. And just as a reminder, we are also recording the session, so just letting you know. And soon all of these lectures will be available online, so we'll also follow up with that. Now I'll let Laura introduce Alfredo, our guest tonight.
Hi, everyone. We're delighted that Alfredo is here to talk about his work today, especially that he has made the effort to join us with an 8-hour time difference to Rome, where he is currently the fellow at the German Academy. When I met Alfredo back in 2014 at Princeton, he already had quite an active practice in Chile, having built a couple impactful pavilions, structures for film sets, and had an ongoing residential project, which has since been published widely. In the ensuing years, since we overlapped, Alfredo has shaped a unique modality of practice that interweaves a series of interests from experimental music to ecological activism, interrogating domestic space and issues of scale, and even the architectural implications of broadcasting radio. He is currently assistant professor at EPFL Lausanne and recipient of the Rome Prize for the German Academy, where he joins us now. We are so lucky to hear from him today, and so without further ado, I'll let you get started, Alfredo.
Thank you. Thank you, Pablo. Thank you, Laura, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you all tonight. It's a little late in Rome, but it's okay. I was telling Pablo and Laura earlier that I've prepared kind of like slide presentation, but then last minute I thought it could be way more interesting if I could, sharing a little bit my fascination with broadcasting, broadcast my studio into your places and have a conversation around what I'm doing now, but also what I've done in the past. But I think the studio where I'm now and how I'm working summarizes pretty well the way in which I work, which has been, let's say, crossed obsession with questions of history that oftentimes manifest in built artifacts. So as Laura said, I'm at the moment a fellow at the German Academy. So that's why I'm in the studio and the so-called Villa Massimo, which is a 10-month residency program. And here I came with the idea to work on a project that perhaps I can tell you a few words about it as we advance our evening tonight, and also finish my book, which is a book on radio, the architecture of radio, is a political investigation on the infrastructures of communication in Berlin. But before we get into that, when I arrived here to Rome, the first week they asked me if I could present my work to the other fellows in some capacity. So what I decided to do was to do this kind of like timeline of images. I don't know if you see, it's almost like a horizon in the studio that makes all the turn all around and finishes to when I'm here, covering roughly the 10 years of my practice. And I just decided to leave these images here, and I thought that it could be helpful maybe to walk a bit through them now with you, and by virtue of doing that, perhaps we can have a more insightful conversation after I finish. So, I mean, these images here are the images of photographs of the very first project I built in Chile. I don't know how much you can see, but this was the scenography for a film. It was my undergrad thesis project in Chile. And it was important for me because more than the project itself, it set a tone, or I wouldn't use the word methodology because it might sound too rigid, but a tone or a set of interests in which I think I still work on, which is, as I said, this intersection with historical questions or problems and how those can be manifested into build structure. So in this film set, I was investigating the life of a monk, a Jesuit monk that lived in Chile at the end of the 18th century. And the Jesuit order was expelled, and all the Jesuit monks were exiled from Latin America due to the power that the Jesuit order had acquired in the Americas. This monk was quite interesting, let's say, thinker. At the time, he had quite, let's say, rebellious ideas related to the Spanish crown and their exercise of power in Latin America at the time. But what caught my attention in the one of the filmmaker that I was working with was that he left a series of letters dedicated to his mother when he was in exile in Imola, in Italy. And these letters were very profound, but also very serious reflections on the notion of exile. What does it mean to live in exile outside of your place, deterritorialized? And he made quite profound observations about that. So in short terms, the film was basically the spatial interpretation of those descriptions of Manuel Lacunza that we found in the letters. And the camera was basically moving through this structure, never revealing it entirely, only by fragments, which was almost like a collection of archetypes for exile. So for example, here you might recognize corridors of a monastery, or in this image here, the structure in the water looks almost as an erratic block. What was interesting is that I decided to build this structure with an incredibly low budget, and I did it all with my own hands in a lake that I knew relatively well. That for reasons that nobody knew at the time was experiencing very unusual fluctuations. So the water would retreat. We built the structure very quickly. And then the water came back, and then we got these reflecting images that we were looking for. But the year after, the lake started to retreat again and never came back. And due to, of course, the very radical impact of climate change in places like Chile. So unintentionally, the project also became almost like a record of that environmental condition. And that, let's say, as I said, set the tone a little bit for a mode of working. And I presented that as my thesis in university, and that, let's say, allowed me a way of working as an architect, but not depending so much or not directly on structures of clients and so on that I didn't have at the time. And that triggered this second project. I don't know if you can see this image, but it's an installation done in front of the Museum of Fine Arts that I did in collaboration with Ariel Bustamante, sound artist. This project was also very important for me because it started a collaboration with Ariel, with whom I have done several projects after, up until last year, but also reaffirm a way of working, as I said, that I was starting to pursue. This was 2013 in Chile. The project was an investigation about Antarctica. Antarctica, I mean, the Chilean government launched a residency program to do, an artisan residency program in Antarctica. And at the time with Ariel, we started to think, well, why we are starting to see that many countries are having these artisan residency programs in Antarctica. We quickly realized that Antarctica is as it is today, in which no country can claim sovereignty over it because of a treaty signed in the late 1950s that stated that no country can exercise any kind of sovereignty in Antarctica besides science. But this treaty is about to end now in 5 more years. So at the time, the geopolitics to start to claim sovereignty over Antarctica were quite harsh, and actually they continue to be so. And culture has been one of the mechanisms to start to claim a certain kind of belonging over Antarctica, right? The classic trope that culture is a form of exercising, for the lack of a better word, colonization. So what we did with this pavilion, I mean, we were invited to present in the Museum of Fine Arts. I mean, I don't know if you see this here, but it's 19th century building in front of this big park. It's a very iconic building. But we decided to not exhibit in the museum, but we decided to put, where you see the red dot, the pavilion right outside of it. And what we did was that we created this sound insulated capsule that maybe in this drawing you can see in the section that is this pipe is floating and hanging from this steel frame that you have around here. And by virtue of that, in a series of different layers, is totally sound insulated. So this point in the city is extremely convoluted and loud, you know, massive protests and manifestations happen here sometimes, so it's extremely loud. And our idea was that you would come into this tube, you would experience a sound composition that Ariel did based on field recordings in Antarctica. But the idea, instead of fulfilling the call of creating a sense of belonging from the Chilean people to Antarctica, we wanted to create the opposite, which was to create a distance as much as possible from an idea of Antarctica, in a sense, passing a message that instead of using culture to raise false ideas of sovereignty and belonging, to create a distance and hopefully allow this exemplary condition of Antarctica to stay as it is. It was quite interesting, the reaction for the project. I don't know if you see here, but there were people lining up outside of it for months on end, and it triggered a quite interesting debate about what's the role of culture in relationship to questions of nature preservation, which we were hoping that could expel beyond Chile, because of course this is a practice that is mostly common in the countries that are now really claiming sovereignty over Antarctica, which is, well, you can imagine what that looks like. So these were the 2 first projects I did in Chile, and then things started to move. I mean, I did the competition for the MoMA program in Santiago. Then I did a second film stage for Mariali Rivas, one of my favorite Chilean filmmakers. And then the Antarctica project had a second life, as you see here. This is a survey photographic survey that the US Air Force did about the surface of Antarctica, more or less at the time that this treaty was written, so in the 1950s that I was just telling you. Mark Lee and Beatriz Colomina asked us to maybe bring this pavilion to Istanbul, because they were interested in this question of Antarctica as a place without humans, when they were doing the design biennale, which was about redesigning the human. For different reasons, we couldn't bring the pavilion itself, but we did a second piece with Ariel. I will not go into too much detail, but it was essentially this ceiling in the gallery with light boxes showing this survey that the US military Air Force did about the surface of Antarctica, and a series of very highly directional speakers were hanging from the ceiling. So people would move through this landscape, encountering the sounds and looking at this very particular way of depicting the territory. And here things start to change a little bit. Then I was already living outside of Chile, and this is was our first house. I also will not go into too much detail. It was a kind of reflection on the traditional typology of the so-called Casa Chilena in Santiago de Chile. There's a typology that was widely spread, but then at the turn of the 19th century, stopped being used for different, again, political and ecological reasons. And as you see in this little diagram, which is almost like the archetype of this typology, you see the connection between the small water channels and the type itself, which was a very strong bond that existed from the time of the colonies in Santiago de Chile between house and nature. We were trying to reinterpret this in this house by thinking what is the relationship between house and courtyard, how to use the full plot, and we had to go through some circumventing some specific regulations. But this, let's say, was our first house project. And then, I mean, I'll just keep moving. There are a few more houses. Some of them got built. Some of them will never get built. Some of them are under construction. This is an interesting project that we developed a lot in Peru, Laura. It was a horse stable in relationship to a housing development in the desert. We also were investigating sort of like complicated political, ecological circumstances that were affecting that region. I think by the effect of those very conditions, this project got canceled. I don't think it will resume. But it was a series of small constructions. Again, I'm trying to understand the relationship between nature and the small constructions there in the desert. This was another house project in Santiago that got built. I mean, in parentheses here, you can see a little bit how I'm working at the moment. This is a mess of books, which are sources that I've been collecting for the work. For the book I'm finishing here. In the back, you see the little greenhouse I've been also testing. I can tell you a few things in a second, and of course the piano. But in any case, this was a small renovation project that we did in Santiago de Chile. It was an existing house. I mean, it's the classic drawing. I'm not sure if you can see the yellow, which is the small walls that we demolished. Red is what we added. So it was a similar investigation on the courtyard house typology that we did in the previous project I just showed you, but this in a slightly more dense urban setting. This is some interior projects I've done since we moved in Berlin. And I mean, and this is interesting just to go through how crazy it is, the amount of work that one produces for projects that sometimes they don't get built. So this is a bit of a sad part of the wall, because I mean, these drawings, they're small, but these were drawn to be printed 1 meter. So each of these things has such an incredible amount of work. This was a house that we developed for a forest in Chile, for different reasons didn't get built. But then after the crisis, political crisis that happened in Chile, we had the chance to do a second project for this, and perhaps I can show you now a few images of that. So that's what's being under construction at the moment. But here it's just you know, meters of drawings that sometimes don't let or don't arrive at the point that you thought they would arrive, and that's just part of the reality of working in this profession, I guess. And let's see, we arrived to this house. What's the best way to show it? Because that's the previous house I just show you, the triangular one that didn't get built. It exploded before the pandemic, a big political crisis in Chile that, you know, didn't allow for many different reasons a structure like this to be built. So then we said, okay, let's just do something a lot simpler. And if you see this section, and it's a very straightforward, simple section, but the peculiarity is that doesn't have a ground, right? You see the tree inside, and it's just a shed. And it's because this forest had a very interesting yet complicated history, which is that the largest fire on history was done intentionally in the south of Chile at the beginning of the 20th century. 1,000 kilometers were burned by German colonizers in order to turn land into agricultural land. So when we arrived to this site, which was amazing, we thought, okay, this is really nature. Here is really pristine. Nobody has ever touched this place. But actually, this is in Patagonia. You had to travel very far. But then you start to dig into the story, and actually, this forest is quite young. It has less than 100 years old. So it's kind of like it's almost like a child. Or a sprout, and then you see in some places some very old trees but dead, which represent for us almost like the ruins, but the ruins of this other form of destruction, right? Perhaps in Chile we don't have Greek temples or Egyptian pyramids, but when you see this, 5,000-year-old trunk laying on the ground in relationship to this very young forest, you understand that there is a process of ruination, but at a different scale. So we thought that this was the most, important dimension to think intervening in a forest like this. So our idea was basically that, at least so that you see the plan here, the plan is basically 3 squares, and the square of the middle doesn't have a ground, which basically allows for a piece of the forest to remain inside the house. And what is interesting for us is that when you move from one side of the house to the other, this space that is semi-insulated, doesn't have heating, confronts you constantly with the exterior. You can almost not avoid it in the constant use of the house. And also, we thought it was quite interesting or powerful, the image of having a piece of the forest that is as old inside the house as it is outside. So, I mean, the rest is very straightforward. These are very simple sections. One square is double height. The second has a kind of like mezzanine. And the third one is the one I just showed you, that has a double height in the tree. And here we have a few images of a museum competition that we did in Chile. We lost. And then finally here, and perhaps this can lead a little bit more to what I'm doing now. These are the images of the project that we did it was the Chilean pavilion in the last Art Biennale. So we dismantled it in November. it was a collective project done together with one of my favorite filmmakers, Dominga Sotomayor, and Miguel Bustamante, the sound artist that I talked to you about. And it was a collective investigation that was instigated by Camila Marambio, the curator, who invited us all to collaborate to research the peatlands of Patagonia. The peatlands is a very specific ecosystem. It is the ecosystem that stores the most carbon in the world. If you were to mine the peatlands in Patagonia, it would represent in terms of carbon footprint the same as if you were burn entire Amazonia 4 times or something like this. But yet nobody or very few people know about it. They are, it's an ecosystem that is mostly underground, but also a very intricate history with the native people that used to inhabit Tierra del Fuego, the Shelcan people that were victims of one of the most brutal genocides in the 20th century. We collaborated with some members of that community into a way, trying to find a way to present the value of the peatlands, contemporary value, but also how they speak about the historical, let's say, condition of the genocide of these people. But it was a story that it's still very much loaded to, or targeted to the future, because the Shelcan people, after being declared extinct, are in the process in a legal litigation with the Chilean state, claiming their status as a living culture. And they are doing that by virtue of reverting their language. That's why the Shelcan language was such an important component in this multimedia installation that we did in Venice. This is a bit full circle very quickly. I mean, we go back then again to first project. But I mean, why do I have this greenhouse here? Now the structure from Venice of the pavilion is coming to the garden of the Villa Massimo. Actually, it arrives tomorrow. So we are rebuilding it here. And instead of having this panorama of images that you just saw, I'm starting to grow these plants here, which is a kind of climbing plant. It has an interesting history. It comes from the rainforest in Mexico and Peru. Laura again, but it was discovered by a monk that wrote the first treaty on medicinal plants of the Americas, trying to import that knowledge into Europe. I just found with this very simple greenhouse the right humidity and temperature, trying to make these climbing plants to germinate, and now they will hopefully overcome the whole structure, and they will remain in the garden of the Villa Massimo. Because we've done this in collaboration with the communities of beekeepers here, and this plant is supposed to be very good for them. So instead of leaving the pavilion for the people, I think we're doing it a little bit more for the bees in this time. So yeah, I'm just having this little construction in the studio to make these seeds germinate. But I'm very happy because a few weeks ago they started to germinate, meaning that they are happy too. So yeah, this is, I don't know how am I with time at the moment, but this is the little tour.
Nick, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. I was just making sure we were ready to move on. That was some awesome work. Super cool seeing your progression all the way through. I like how you just went in a full 360. I feel like that's a really cool way to show off your work, especially with having to I'd love to go in there in person and put my face in front of all those little images and get what I can out of them. I appreciate you showing us all that. I guess I'd like to start with a question about, it kept coming up throughout a lot of your work. You talked a lot about unbuilt projects. And while I was looking into your work, I found that some of those projects also were your works on those artifacts and all that. So I was wondering, how has that like affected your career in terms of like ways of thinking, and as well as just like, I would also like to know like how it's affected maybe kind of in a way your business model as well, but mostly like the theory and all that behind it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been unintentionally pragmatic since I started, or since I decided to be an architect. And I think these slightly more experimental projects that I did at the beginning, which, well, I mean, I think I could say a few things about it, but instead of me trying to do, something that was not conventional architecture or something like this, was actually the opposite. I knew that, I knew a bit what it takes to be an architect in Chile, at least at the time when I graduated. You had to know somebody that could commission you your first project, and that's how you would start your practice. If you didn't get that person early on in your life, means that you will work for somebody forever. And it's a very brutal system in that way. And I knew that I didn't have access to that network, so I said, okay, I just want to build stuff, and I don't want to wait and sit in a table waiting for somebody to call me, because I know this is not going to happen. So, with people of my generation, young filmmakers, or in other case, sound artists, I just thought that, there was a very pragmatic way for me to start to get things done, and not anything but things that, I had a certain, real compromise with the work. And there have been different phases. At some point, I also thought, okay, when some more conventional projects started to arrive, I thought, okay, this is going to be perhaps something of the past, and we will start to do more, let's say again, normal. So the ghost of the normal always hunts me, and it comes, but then for one reason or another, doesn't take the shape that it promises. And yet again, I've kept working on these small experimental projects that at some point they're not so small anymore, and then they found different venues. And that has become something more and more important to my practice, to the point that today I dedicate most of my time to those projects, being them written or in let's say installation pavilion format, and I dedicate less time to doing things that have building permission, for example. And perhaps, I don't know if this is the what's happening today with times of crisis or not, I don't know, but I started to understand that the dichotomy better, and to feel comfortable with it as well. I don't know if that responds.
Oh yeah. No, yeah. It's I think it's super like fascinating looking at that work in particular, because like it has been very thoroughly thought out, and you can, I don't know exactly the timeline of where all these things lined up, but you can see how it's potentially influenced your work along the line throughout your career. So it's cool to see that. I guess I was going to ask another question, and then I'll pass it off to others who have questions in the crowd. I had a pretty specific question, and it was about your one of your artifacts. I can't remember which one it was, but it was about the one that you had for that cinematography project that you burnt down, and the interior was a secret that wouldn't be revealed to the public. I was wondering what kind of thought process went into that, and what kind of like how you approached it. Was it something that you really wanted to make this like amazing thing just for yourself, or was it something that maybe just could have been this thing where like, oh, it is a secret, but
Mhm.
it
Yeah.
doesn't really have to be much.
Yeah, no, actually, it's interesting because I think that was you're speaking about my very first project, the one that I speak a little bit at the beginning. I spoke about in the beginning. In I, it was not that it was the interior was a secret, but what was the secret, quote unquote, was the totality. So because what I you know, it's not a great discovery, but you know, it was my very first project, and I discovered this amazing thing that actually cinema doesn't care about totality. You know, you cannot, even if you like, you know, you cannot show the full thing. You know, even if I want to show you this, I can only show you a part of it, right? I mean, it's impossible for me to. Whereas architecture, we are always concerned with this question of totality, especially if you think in terms of tectonics and unity. So what I find out is that I could work with in basically building one structure, but thinking of it for the camera, I could have 10 projects. So essentially, the project was a collection of fragments, and the camera would only reveal these fragments. And through montage, you would start to get pieces of it, but you would never see the full structure. And instead of let's say keeping it as a secret, it was just like, again, a very pragmatic decision to basically, you know, entertain a full short film only with a building that was 4 by 8 square meters in plan. So I mean, I don't have, maybe I have here. I think I have an image of a model that I did. Yeah, this one. So you know, here I was testing all the shoots. You know, with it's a wire model. So I was, you know, looking at all the possible shots that you could have in the structure, and you would never see the full thing. And yeah, my advisor at the moment was saying like, you're doing a cubism in reverse instead of like showing the multiple points of view of one object. You are just, you know, never revealing the total. And I think it was quite interesting lesson for architecture as well, that you could think from, you know, the fragment. There's a full tradition of, you know, I didn't invent anything, but I just learned about it by virtue of this project.
Cool. Yeah, that definitely makes me think about like going on like a hike and going to the vantage points and like seeing these framed views that are just in nature. That's like completely reminds me of the way you just described all that.
Mm-hmm.
Seems like a super cool experience. If anyone has any questions, I could pass on some stuff to whoever.
I have a question really quick. I don't know if you guys can hear me.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I was wondering how, as a young undergrad architecture student who's interested a lot in film, get started in that sort of world of being an architect, but in the film industry. And I'm assuming that the US film industry is probably a fair bit different, but maybe there's some advice.
Yeah, I mean, my relationship with cinema, I'm not sure if I could recommend it to anybody. It's a bit traumatic, but I mean, in my case, yeah, I mean, I think it's very different in Chile than in the US, and also in Europe, I would say. At least my experience was that in Chile, you know, up until the 90s, to be a filmmaker or to decide to be a filmmaker, it was something that it was almost dangerous, you know. I mean, the dictatorship ended at the beginning of the 90s. If you were to be a filmmaker in the 80s, you would have done shitty commercials and starve, or not do anything at all. but in the late 90s and beginning of the 2000s, it started to emerge a very interesting film scene in Chile that, I mean, now, recently was someone got an Academy Award, but also, there's always now one or two Chilean productions either in Cannes, or it emerged an interesting film scene. And for me at the time, I just, friends of mine were starting to do these things. So it was more than trying to get a foot on an industry. It was more of a generational thing. I was more interested at the time in the people that were doing film, but not big movies, but they were experimenting with their phones, with cheap cameras that they were buying in, a fair or something like this. And also music, it was an interesting music scene. And these were the two things that for me were the most relevant, but again, as a generational thing. And perhaps this comes back to how this seminar was put together by Laura. I guess this is an interesting reflection for you as well, is what constitutes a generation. Perhaps it's a set of interests, or perhaps a set of practices that by virtue of the limitations or the opportunities of your time, you can do things that in previous times would have been, not the most intelligent. Or so I guess my answer perhaps is not very useful, but it has to do more with being attentive to the people around you, and trying to find ways to get the work going. I'm sure there must be other ways to enter an industry more officially, but this I don't know how.
No, thank you. That helps. Gives me some good insight. And then just you touched on it a little bit, maybe with how traumatic it was, but I was just wondering, how is work life different when you're working as just a traditional architect versus one who works more in like film media or music medium, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, the structure of my quote unquote office has always been a bit flexible. And that allows you to take a little more risk. I mean, again, in my case, everything's a bit counterintuitive, but I think I've almost lose money with the official projects. And the practice can survive with the more experimental ones, because I guess at some point you learn how to do the building permission architecture more efficiently, which I haven't got there yet. But it takes so much time. It is so constrained by regulations, but then we are in moments of crisis. So I mean, projects of us either stop because of a political crisis, then the pandemic, then our fires. And all of this delays the work, and you cannot, kick out the people that are collaborating with you just like this. So it's very slow. It puts a lot of pressure at many levels. Whereas these other things, I mean, are a lot more about collaboration. Are less bureaucratic to a certain extent, and I don't see also that this is a big divide there, but I think, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question of yours because I think my mindset really changes when I'm working on something that you have the pressure to submit something for a building permission or produce a set of drawings that has to be very precise for to pass a certain law code. It's it's a slightly different set of questions. But then perhaps with this I wrap up. But then this rigor is super important to do slightly more experimental things, because the rigor is with yourself. Nobody there are no building codes for these things. And to have a certain again, a rigor that you can impose onto yourself, and what you know that things are right, that have a certain kind of like work ethics behind it, help also to make some stranger things to be possible and feasible. So I think there's a bit of a retrofit there too.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you for the question.
Some good questions. Lara and Matthew Mamich.
Matt, do you want to go or should I?
If you go. No, no, go for it. Yeah.
Okay. Alfredo, thanks so much. It's really fascinating, and I mean, I can see that there's so many people here who would probably want to talk to you for hours about this, and you have to let us know when you want to go, because I realize it's already midnight in Rome. But while we have you on the screen and we can still keep you for a few more minutes, I guess I wanted to ask something that maybe builds on this idea of your practice being multidisciplinary, and the notion that many of the projects seemingly go in different directions. And in a way, it's how you were talking about that very first structure, the film set or your thesis work, where perhaps there is a single body and many different ways to look at it. Or perhaps there are just many different directions and there actually isn't a single body. But I'm talking about how do you construct the idea of your practice in a way. Do you think, and I think this is super useful for students, do you think that it's important to have that level of synthesis or to see everything as a whole? Or is it okay to kind of, work in multiple directions?
Yeah, no, I think this is super, super interesting because, in the crazy world in which we live, in which things circulate through different media very quickly. At some point, I started just to experience that the projects have parallel lives, and there's something, and that's why it was important for me, this very first project, because, for example, I took very seriously the more historical research, and I took the time to go to visit certain archives, and this is stuff that nobody was asking me to do, but it was so important for me that, what I was going to write about this would make sense, because I wanted, to communicate this. But then when I worked with the filmmaker, it was mostly the film, what we thought would survive of the project. But then, films have a slightly larger time span of attention. So then the project circulated also in images. And as you said, I think this sort of like obsession for trying to have a very cohesive whole, even though these are very simple projects, they have a lot of parallel existences, and I think that's also when it comes the multi into it, which is trying to speak to different audiences using different media, and of course you don't do all of it. One has very limited skills, and that's why you reach out to colleagues and you collaborate. But I think it's interesting to start, letting go this obsession with a certain perfectly cohesive whole, but understand that projects have different channels of communication, and then they can have some overlaps, but also some deviations, each of these media that communicate aspects of the project, don't know if that makes sense.
Cool. We can we'll do Matt now. Matt, you want to ask your question?
Hi, yeah, I was just, whoa, and Nick's probably done. I was just curious. So I saw you had the piano in there, and I was listening to Nick was telling me about some of your work with like blending music with architecture, or using sound like you showed us in that that I forget the name in front of the museum there. But I was just curious, like, how do you use music or sound to like influence your projects? Like, is it like a case by case, or do you see it as like this like cohesive like theme that you kind of apply to these projects, or like, how do you view and like use sound or music?
Yeah, no, I mean, thank you for the question, because it's a difficult one, in the sense that I think one possibility to answer would be that it's very case by case. So I think at some point in time there were some weird metaphors between architecture and music, that the architecture is frozen music, or vice versa. I can't remember. I never liked that very much. At least I couldn't resonate too much. But I mean, I always had for example, it's very accepted that architects are very well trained and savvy about the graphic medium. Nobody would ask an architect, oh, but how are you so interested in painting or something? It's totally accepted. It is less so with music. So in my case, I was way more interested in music than, let's say, in the graphics when I started, and that led me to have very specific collaborations with people that really know about sound. So I think when I've worked on that, the few things I know help me to just be a good sounding board or a good partner. But actually, I've collaborated with people that's really the core of their practice, but because of, let's say, a common interest, we find a ground where to collaborate. But on the other hand, since as I told you, music is just like a general interest that I have now, and I had from the very beginning. I think it basically transpires through all things you do. So when I was never classically trained in the piano or anything, but when I play, for me, I think I play as an architect. I'm doing like geometric patterns, systems of proportion, rhythms, all things that are part of the repertoire of things that we as architects deal with. And when I've done the few records I've done, I would never consider myself a musician. It's like as an architect playing with the piano or something like this. Yeah, so I think it goes a bit like this. I have a because I think I work in this interdisciplinary, I have a very big respect for disciplines, and I don't like to be defined myself as anything else than an architect, because I know very well that I'm not an artist. I know very well that I'm not a musician, because I know these people, and I have very big respect for what they do. But I think if one is open about one's own discipline, you can reach out to others and have interesting dialogues.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because I played piano as well, and I was never classically trained, and I think about that the same way, of like shapes and geometries and like different organizations. But it's interesting applying that to architecture. Thank you.
No, thank you for the thank you, and you gotta share those recordings.
Well, it looked like Juan, you had a question, but you put your hand down, so I'm not sure exactly what that means.
Yeah, that's right. I just didn't want to bother that much Alfredo, because it's very late there, but it's fine. Is it fine for you to make another question, Alfredo?
yeah, let's just. I mean, I think around like 1/4 past, I need to start wrapping up. So I think we have a few
Okay,
more minutes
great.
now.
So I just wanted to make a quick question about, like, you've been talking a lot about the unfinished and your work and the never built and all these as a process. And I found interesting when you suddenly said the topic of your PhD thesis at some point, or dissertation, and it sounded so finished. No, with the research, everything needs to be so specific. And you said like infrastructure of the radio in the city of Berlin, and suddenly it's a big contrast with the way we work. I'm asking a little bit also as a PhD candidate. So it's a strange, because we're always in this world of the unfinished, and suddenly you need to focus a lot on something that it's very specific. And I wanted to know how much does it influence your work, or if you separate it a lot, or you work in different ways with practice and research.
Yeah, I mean, I think I once Jean-Louis Cohen, who's somebody I have the highest respect, told me one has to play each game by their own rules. And when I started to do the research about radio in Berlin, it was mostly because I mean, it touched a lot my interest on, you know, sound and architecture, but it was also a bit of an accident that I encountered these amazing buildings. Then I realized that there was very little about them, and I just wanted to know more. And then I said, okay, there's not enough written about them. I guess I'm the man for the job. But it was a relatively genuine, and then, you know, it's like everything, you know, I said, okay, this has to be a book, and you cannot write a book about, you know, 1,000 things, especially if you're not a good writer like me. You know, one has to, you know, be precise and try to, you know, put certain constraints. And I think, yeah, this has been very interesting for me to write a first book, and how one uses, let's say, architectural training to also structure a book. You know, now we were just speaking about how you can use basic understanding of geometry and rhythm to do a bit of music. And with the book, you know, for me, I spent so much time thinking about its structure, you know, but literally, like, does it stand up? You know, what is the hierarchy? What are the main things, and what are, you know, secondary? And I think, you know, at least in my case, I could reach a certain degree of precision with topic and interest, because I guess we were trained with this particular mindset. Perhaps, you know, if I would have been trained as a painter, I would have approached it differently. But and in that sense, I see it complementary in a way. That and I think that's why there's a tradition in our discipline that that architects, not always, but it's not uncommon that you write books. I mean, at some point, this is something that the building has, or buildings or a practice has a certain limitation, and you reach out to this other medium, but you're always working within your set of tools, or I don't know. But yeah, but I mean, as I said before, it was a very also genuine start. But yeah, it's
yeah, sounds super interesting. Also, I think it's really fascinating. So also let us know when you finish it to read it. But yeah, thank you for the lecture.
Thank you.
Well, I guess we should start wrapping it up here. Thank you so much for your time. Super fascinating stuff. We really appreciate you calling in so late at night. So
no, thank you. Somehow, you know, it's been almost a year of me being away from the US, so it was a good catch up with you all.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Alfredo.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thanks, Alfredo.
Thank you.
Hope to talk to you again soon. Ciao.
Yeah, and good luck with the rest of the series. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye.